housing of most people coming to this country, then and still, is to own land. And when they came here, there was a lot of it. And the cities were able to expand and people were able to have housing on ridiculously large blocks of land, quarter-acre blocks, because there was plenty. Even when we had an equivalent housing crisis to which we have now, which was at the end of World War II, when many of us were born as baby boomers, our parents were struggling to find somewhere to live. Nothing had been built right through the 20s and 30s, except for various big housing estates, which were quite expensive. There was a terrible shortage of materials. There was acute labour shortage. And because during the war, the government had been able to use war powers to have controls over prices and rent in a way that they cannot normally under our constitution, therefore there were rent controls. Now when people say, oh, we've got to have rent control, they don't realise that we'd have to go to a referendum for the government to be able to do that. But, you know, that doesn't bother young radicals. They don't think that, you know, they're actually a constitution and political practices are actually a barrier to instant reform. Because I think there are two big problems we've got. The first big problem is the one I'm going to describe to you. The second big problem is that we've been brainwashed for a very long time. Naomi Klein sees this as the fault of Hollywood, that there are magical solutions to big problems. You know, and there are magical leaders who will come in. I mean, how many people have I heard, oh, I wish we had Gough back? Well, it's, you know, you can't. And he was a lot better as a reformer of the Labour Party than he was as a Prime Minister. Now, he did a lot of very great things, but, you know, it failed. And it failed because his government was starting to do something that really scared the big money. And that was Rex Connor, as Minister for Minerals, wanting to start effectively what the Norwegians have, which is a sovereign fund which makes the money and owns the minerals for the country. But no, we can't have that. So a conspiracy is there. Prince Philip had called Gough Whitlam that socialist arsehole. And so the royal family does the dirty work of the CIA and of the big money owners, and that government is brought down because it actually was beginning to strike at the heart of how wealth is made and distributed in this country. So we go back to the fact that, first of all, governments are very limited in what they can do. So Albo cannot send out an email, sorry young people, and say rents have got to go down by 40%, which is probably what they'd need to go down to make the reform. Neither can he send out an email saying we're going to build more housing next week and we'll be ready at the end of the month. That's not going to happen either, and can't. The housing crisis that was there by the late 1940s in Australia was not fixed until the 1970s. And that was through the other thing that they realised they were able to do, which was through state governments being able to build public housing. So what they did, the things that made a difference to people getting their houses, was institutions like the State Bank, which gave people reasonable loans with low interest to buy a house. But the other big one was all the benefits that ex-servicemen got. So the big increase in private ownership before the Second World War had been in the 1920s and 30s with war service homes. The soldier settlers movement had mixed success, and a lot of it was a failure because they were in the wrong part of the state to have small farms, but the big success was the war service homes, which built a solid constituency of homeowners who were then secure. And even if they went through periods, I've seen the records, where they lost their job, they didn't lose their house. They still died in that house they'd been able to buy as a war service home loan in 1922. So here you've got what has been made the difference in people getting housing has actually been government intervention and giving benefits, because what they did for the war service was that they effectively set up a welfare state just for returned servicemen. So they got medical services if they could prove that their health problem was linked to their actual service exposure. And that was very difficult to prove, by the way, so all the stories of the nastiness of the repat should be thought through again. But the other thing, of course, the government did for them was to give them job preference, so that returned men got job preference for government jobs. So the public service was entirely full of returned soldiers, which had a certain conservative effect on the administration of the public service. But local government jobs, except in Richmond where the Luffman family got their relatives' jobs, most of the people working in council jobs had been ex-servicemen. They got preference over everyone else. This was deeply resented, and there was a big sort of underground trade in returned servicemen's badges, because if you stole one and could wear it, you could get a job. So let's say here we've got this privileged group going through, and they're getting housing and no one else is. We end up by the 1930s, and what you've got there, what became the great period of the terrible slums of Struggletown, and some of the really worst slums were in places which are now very fashionable, like Cremorne. That was where it was stinking, that's where it was flooded, that's where there was filth everywhere, that's where people had one tap if they were lucky. I remember one of the ladies I interviewed for Struggletown, she said, I lie in bed and I'm living here in Stanley Street, and I was lying in bed and I was counting all my taps. I've got 8 taps. And all I wanted was more than 2 in one. Now I've got 8 taps. And she had trees in her street. I mean, these were huge things because life was so hard. A lot of houses had no floor. They had a dirt floor. They were full of damp. They stank. So this is what Richmond wanted. Why was it like that? Who were the rich landlords ripping all these people off? They were little old ladies who'd inherited the house from their dad, who built it when he was a carpenter to see them through old age. So if you go through the report done by the beginnings of the Housing Commission, the big investigation of slum housing, and look, they list all the names of the landlords, these terrible, rapacious, appalling landlords, and they're all poor people. And they're single women. And they've got no money whatsoever, and they're living off the $8 or $9 or $10 a shilling rent that they're getting for that house. So of course nothing was fixed, everything went downhill. So the slums just got worse and worse. That's the reality. And we are going back to having a landlord class, many of whom are as poor as their tenants. A lot of them, particularly here, are former factory workers or small tradesmen, migrants, who bought a house because that was the thing you were encouraged to do as an investment. They've now reached old age. The rent they're getting is not enough to live on, and they can't get the pension because they've got 2 properties. If they sell the property, they of course have to pay capital gains, and then they have to wait 5 years before they qualify for the age pension. Now, these are the sorts of reforms that might loosen up a bit of housing. Another reform might be to make it easier for older people with a large property to be able to downsize without having to pay very large stamp duty. Or I would like to be able to transfer a title to one of my children. But to do that, we're going to have to pay large stamp duty and possible capital gains. But I want to do that because what I've done is cash in all my superannuation and use that to build a second house on the large block we had in North Melbourne. And my one daughter lives in one house and the other daughter lives in the other, each with their families. But I don't have much left. So I'd like to be able to do that too. But the thing is that I was able to rearrange what we had, which was all we had was that property in North Melbourne, to house 3 families now. Now, people need to be able to make those sorts of arrangements. It's perfectly normal in the rest of the world for multi-generation families to live together. It used to be perfectly normal for people to have borders. If you looked at the surveys they did in 1942 of inner city communities, scarcely a house in Richmond or North Melbourne didn't have multiple occupants, including people who weren't relatives or their other relatives. That it is normal for people to live together. It's actually quite good to live with other people. It's very good for your health. And if you find you're fighting all the time, well, perhaps you need some counselling. But so I'm going around the places a bit, but what I'm trying to get to you is that the legacies of what we've inherited are, and in the past, these problems also existed. And why they were able eventually, after nearly 30 years, to fix the housing shortage in Victoria was a combination of both market forces and government intervention. And Henry Bolte, of all people, had to build an incredible amount of public housing. So nearly all the towers were built by Liberals. And like most of the high schools were built by the Liberals. They had to build 80 high schools in the space of about 12 years, because no one had built any high schools in Melbourne, in Victoria before, because people weren't meant to go to high school unless they were rich enough to go to a private school. So I finished school in Box Hill in 1960. There was nowhere where I could go to high school. Box Hill High had just started doing matric. It was only for boys. I'd have had to go to a central school and try and get to Camberwell, which had only just started doing matric. I did what my father did and my grandfather did, and which I'd been brought up to think I would have to do, which is I went for a scholarship. Because what middle class kids did was go for scholarships. Because you did not provide schools. High schools were only in the western and northern suburbs, a couple of them, and in the country, and their job was not to produce people who'd become doctors and lawyers, but teachers and public servants. So suddenly we get into the post-war era and people are saying, hey, we want our kids to get an education. We want our kids to go to high school. We want our kids to go to university. Now that is driven by the reconstruction of Australia with the Labor government of Ben Chifley after the war. And so much of what we take and say, oh, it's Bob Menzies. No, it wasn't. He just carried on what had already been started. So the things about suddenly expanding universities, Commonwealth scholarships, research grants, school and housing, all of those things start with Ben Chifley and Nugget Coombs, who began to think in a whole way about the economy. And one of the commitments was to be, as it was in the UK with the Labor government, we will now commit to full employment. And they had never done that before. Now they had Keynesian economics, it was working. The war left them with a labour shortage rather than a surplus of men who couldn't get jobs as it had in 1918. We're going to have full employment. And we're going to make sure that the economy grows. And one of the biggest ways they did that, and the way that they built what is now a middle-class country largely, was through government investment. So the middle class owes most of its prosperity to government intervention. All sorts of jobs are paid for by taxpayers directly or indirectly. Teaching, nursing, public service, social work, management, health, overall that, all of that expanded incredibly after the Second World War. Now they were constrained in what they could do. They had tried again to have a referendum to give the Commonwealth government the same powers as they had under emergency wartime powers. That failed, even though that was at the height of Curtin and Chifley's the first one was in 1944, extending Commonwealth powers. That's when John Curtin was at the peak of his respect and popularity as our greatest Prime Minister. They still couldn't win it. People were scared of government control. So don't go asking the government to do stuff they cannot do under the Constitution. Now, if someone would send a message to Adam Band and tell him that, I'd be very grateful. But he's not, they don't want to hear it, and certainly that ridiculous person, Campbell Mather, likewise, Chandler Mather, sorry, but he doesn't listen. But sorry mate, you can't do it. And Labor has tried 3 times under Hawke, under Curtin and Chifley, and in 1912, to change the Constitution to give government more power over intervention in the economy. So what has happened? We have a middle class that's built in the 1950s and 60s through the acquisition of private property. At that time, if they were going to expand and build new houses in suburbs, they had plenty of room that was still close to the city comparatively. So Balwyn and North Balwyn was the outer suburbs. All of those suburbs to the east, new housing, a lot of it built quite simply of timber, and what did they have in the streets? Just mud. I mean, all those pictures of people walking through streets with mud up to their knees. They had indoor toilets perhaps, but some weren't sewered. But none of the facilities that we expect now for the housing development were built. And then they had to build the schools, and then people got together and put up a kindergarten. And so all of that developed, but it was possible. The land was there, it wasn't too far from the city. We can't build any more Craigieburns. We just cannot and mustn't. As in Sydney, they cannot build any more Mount Druitts. They were disasters. It's too far from economic activity. You're building new communities where there is no infrastructure. All of that has to be built. And you're putting in there young families who have high needs of infrastructure like hospitals and schools and kindergartens and childcare. Craigieburn, lovely houses, but there's one major road that feeds that suburb. I remember going out there to give a talk at night, and there was an accident on Mickleham Road. Well, my God, everything stopped. And then I had to try and find my way back somehow to get maybe possibly to the Hume Highway. And I got into the housing estate, and it was just like being in Canberra, where your suburb is actually constructed in the model of a placenta, where all the streets are going this and this and this and ending in round bits and going that way. You think, where the hell am I? And of course, from doing that in Canberra, particularly in the Western Valley and down that part, when the bushfires came through and people couldn't see a foot in front of their nose, and how the hell were they going to get out? It was very lucky they weren't all incinerated. And of course, at the end of each artery out of the placenta going into the main artery of the main road, there's always a petrol station. Anyway, yes. That's another story about how to plan for mass extinction through bushfire. But, you know, those suburbs, during the pandemic, the reason that the city of Hume had the lowest vaccination rates was it was taking people an hour and a half to drive somewhere there where there might be a doctor. Doctors don't practice there because people need them to be bulk billing, and they can't make enough money by bulk billing. So there's a shortage of doctors. And anyway, you know, the coffee isn't as good. Plus, their children might have to go to school with the locals, and that might harm their chances of getting into the University of Melbourne down the track. So, you know, these are the sort of real issues that happen in country towns and in outer suburbs. Greenvale and that part of Melbourne and the city of Hume went from having the lowest rates of vaccination of any part of Melbourne to having the highest. And this is the power of political leadership. Because the mayor of Hume is a bloke called Joseph Hawil, who's an Iraqi Christian refugee originally, in fact, our parents were. and his mayor, he's a good Labor man, and he bullied the state government every day that they had to have pop-up clinics for vaccination. But the other problem was that the community, only about 30% speak English regularly at home. And it's a multitude of languages and a multitude of faiths. And through the WhatsApp groups, going through all those language communities, were messages like, the vaccination makes you impotent, the vaccination gives you cancer. So Joseph then got all the imams, the heads, the monks from the temple, all the different churches, the Orthodox Church, the Syrian Church, and so on. He got all those leaders together, and they worked together on a communication program within their congregations to persuade them that the thing was safe. And Joseph's private work is a leader of a very big business doing translations, so they got translations and they had the pop-up clinics. And he said one day he watched an interpreter spend an hour with an old man persuading him that it was safe to be vaccinated. And they went from having the lowest rate of vaccination in Melbourne to the highest. Now that's the power of local government, but it's also showing you the difficulties they've got, that when you put people and solve your housing problem that way, you don't solve it, you create a different sort of housing problem. So if we're to house people, we're going to have to do it in the bit of land we have, which is the existing metropolitan area. And we're going to have to do it where there's a lot of wasted land, and it's a terrible thing to say, but there are a lot of very large gardens in the middle ring of suburbs, which are lovely, but as people get older, they can't keep them up. And if you go a bit further east to Box Hill, where the City of Whitehorse has been very lax about building regulation and uncovered big development, and plus the City of Whitehorse is driven by two very powerful economic engines. The first is the Box Hill Hospital, which is now a specialist teaching hospital and has a huge ecosystem around it of all sorts of specialisms and consultants and so on, and students. The second one is the Box Hill TAFE, which is also vast. So those two institutions have driven extraordinary expansion in Box Hill, which has attracted a huge number, principally of Chinese people, who have also brought money in and have been investing in high-rise housing and so on. So they've got real high-rise apartment blocks. Everybody goes, oh, but they've got homes, they've got air conditioning, they've got heating and good lifts and all of those things you get in a properly run high-rise. And if you go on Google Maps, you'll see, I grew up there, and the streets I used to walk through as a kid, all of those very big blocks of land have got multi-occupant houses on them now. They've been cut in half, they've been pulled down, they've built villas, they've built apartment blocks, they've densified Box Hill, old Box Hill, extraordinarily. And I'm sorry, Canterbury, but that's going to happen to you. So that's the sort of crunch. And now the real issue is that if I were to divide you all into three groups, we won't do this because it will waste time, but imagine one of you are people who own your house outright. Now within that there'll be people who'll be doing okay, but there'll be others who are retired. Some of those will be okay because they're on superannuation, the others will be on pension. So your cash flow is going to be an issue. On the other hand, if you are living on super, particularly if you've been a public servant or a teacher, you've got a pretty good super bank behind you. What do you need out of the economy? You need house values to go up, and you need interest rates to go up, and go up a lot. The next group, now you're about a third, 37% of the electorate owns their own home outright. And these are the ones that the young ones are all hating and blaming, and it's all their fault and so on. The second group are those who've got a mortgage. And they will divide into people who are towards the end of paying off their mortgage, it's not that big, and there'll be new people on a new mortgage, And that new mortgage will be huge. It might be $800,000. So when there's a small interest rate increase, the increase in their payments are catastrophic. On the other hand, since they've now entered the magic land of being a house owner, they need the value of their property to continue to rise. So they need interest rates low, and they want property values to keep rising, and rising strongly. So the minute you buy a house, you switch from wanting the prices to go down to wanting them to go up. That's another third of the voting population. The last third, of course, have got nothing. They're landless. They have to rent. And they need either the community and society to say, right, housing is a human right, and this is something which most people, and particularly increasingly young people for the rest of their lives, will never be able to afford themselves. We've got to do something collectively about that. Now, you've got three groups about equal numbers. What does a political party do with that if you're going to win the election? So one party, Labor Party in 2019, says, oh, we'll get rid of negative gearing. Negative gearing being got rid of will probably reduce prices no more than about 2%. And in time that'll be eaten up by inflation in prices. The discount on capital gains would be a good idea, but there might be people who are cash poor who that might hit if they were downsizing. So do you need something? So, okay, they tried that and Labor lost the election. Don't everybody who's screaming now, oh, we've got to get rid of capital gain, negative gearing, remember that. It's no good losing an election. It is no good being in opposition because you can't do anything. So that's the wicked choice there. You could scream and scream and scream about getting prices down, but what's the mechanism for getting prices down? Does Albo ring up Australia and say, no, you've got to drop house values at 40% or 50%? You can't do it. And what would happen to you 2/3 who own or own mortgages? God help us, should be out on the street with pitchforks. Because your security is locked up in your property. Now, we go back that housing becomes something like healthcare. Now, this might sound a bit odd, but I hope none of you have had a massive health crisis which has involved a long stay in hospital, ICU, rehabilitation, perhaps chemotherapy. And if you looked at the real cost of that, as happens to people in America, and my husband and I had consecutive years where that happened to us both, we would have been completely wiped out if we had to pay for those costs. Because even when you pay for your surgeon and the anaesthetist, that's a fraction of the cost of the delivery of your care. Because the delivery of a medical service includes everybody who works in the hospital, including the cleaners. It includes the whole infrastructure of research and universities. It includes the whole regulation of pharmaceuticals. It includes the whole regulation of the sector. And a huge number of people, going even down to students, because you are actually needing to pay for the people who are studying to become the new doctors and nurses. That's the real cost of medical care. There is no way. Only Gina Reinhardt could actually pay for her care for what the real cost is. And we never factor in these real costs. So of course, we collectively pay for those things through taxation. And it's just like paying house insurance on fire, where you pay out increasingly outrageous amounts of money for insurance against flood and bushfire, and increasingly you're having to call on it. But for most people in the city, by the end of their life, they have probably never had to call on their insurance for their house because it's been burnt down. Do they lie on their deathbed saying, oh, crumbs, think of all that money I wasted on paying fire insurance? No, of course not, because over their lifetime that gave comfort and security. And the same is with the health service, in that we pay comparatively little through our tax for a collective service that amortises our risk. Now, what a socialist view is that there are social goods of which education is one and health is another, that individuals cannot ever, unless they're super rich, pay for entirely themselves. It's all very well, you can't do it yourself, you haven't got enough money, and the service itself is so complex, no individual can do that. So we don't even think twice to say that's a social good that we must collectively pay for. Let's come to housing. That's a social good too. And the mantra of Labor parties has been, what Lord Beveridge called the 5 giant evils of want, homelessness, disease, ignorance and idleness. And that's what the welfare state was to address, and which it did for the first 30 years after the Second World War. And they did that because the Second World War, on top of the Depression and the First World War, had bullied, in effect, historically, the rich into paying high tax rates. And so the marginal tax rate in the United States, right through the 1950s and 60s, was 90%. And similar in the UK. So it was for the first time, and the only time, that the super rich were required to transfer their excess profits and wealth to the common good. Now, what is Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan all about? It's a revolt against that. And so with the combination of the Vietnam War and this revolt led by economic theorists that they couldn't work out how to manage inflation, which was getting out of control, and so they have this wonderful new theory called monetary theory, and we just let it all rip. That undermined that short period, which is sort of a social democratic golden moment. But our prosperity was built then. Our middle class was built then. It depended on significant government investment. Even while everybody's screaming, oh, it's going to be communism, no, that's not communism, that's different. And it's not Joe Stalin walking down your street telling you what to do. They're not going to take your house. It actually says in the Labor Party manifesto that you have the right to own private property, you have the right to farm, you have the right to run a business. That's in the Labor rules and has always been there. But you won't hear that, from the Conservatives, because they recognise humans' needs for independence, for self-realisation, for being able to control their lives, and you do control your life better if you own your own place and so on. But now we've got to a situation where housing is a fundamental human right, shelter is a human right recognised in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and yet it's something that a significant number of individuals, and it will get more and more of them, and a larger proportion of the population, who cannot provide it themselves. And they cannot provide it not because they're poor earners, it's because the commodity itself, the land, has become outrageously overvalued. So Australians have been very lazy. We came here and stole land. We wanted land, so we took it. We then went and used it very carelessly, and we doled it all out in big chunks in cities, and we've gone and lived off that and built our wealth privately on that. And the thing about making your money out of owning land is that you do not do any work. You just sit there and its value grows. So in terms of the economy, you're not contributing. You're taking out of the economy. You're putting not just people who need housing in trouble, you're putting every business in peril. Because it's not just housing rent that's impossible, so is business rent. So you're paying for land rent for every item you buy. Every service you need, you are paying for the land that work is done on. And so we've got this part of the economy and everybody with stakes in it living off something that just is and just grows in wealth and makes people wealthy, but it doesn't actually generate any economic activity. It just sucks money out of the economy. It's sucking dollars out of people's pockets that they could spend buying better vegetables and fruit. So now we've got to this position where land has this power over our society and the ownership of it, where it's doing very cruel to people. So what do we do about it? Well, as we have always done in Australia, we have to come to the collective, to the government, to do something about it. And now governments are faced with this new crisis where people are in a position where they cannot make enough money, even with a very good job or two jobs, to be able to buy their own place. It's just been in the paper the last 2 days. We've got people on high incomes who've got no alternative but to rent, because they might be able to buy a house somewhere, but it's so far from where they need to work or where their family is, it's no use to them. So we've got a basic human need which isn't being met. So what does government do? It is also constrained by the fact of the value of land is so over the top. So if it's going to build new housing, it's got to get land. Now, the public housing, the Ministry of Housing, in fact, owns houses all over Melbourne. It doesn't tell you about it. They've bought them over many years. It's got all sorts of little bits of land, and it wants to build. It's been trying to build and has been building small operations and units, and there's a lot in North Melbourne like this where they've just built 3 places or 4 places. Danny Pearson, who was Minister for Housing, he's the member for Essendon, and he lives in Ascot Vale, and he has a neighbour who's African, and they've been good friends over many years, and he's done a lot for him. And it was after 15 years that he discovered that, in fact, all this time his neighbour was living in government housing. He didn't know his next door house was government owned. And that's, of course, how social housing should be. It should be invisible. By putting people into highly visible apartment blocks and concentrations, you put them at risk. And having concentrations of people who've got particular problems. And one of the things that happened here with Jeff Kennett was that when he closed the psychiatric hospitals, all those people were ejected, largely into the flats at the bottom of our street. And we had people wandering the streets in front of our house who were off their minds because they hadn't had their medications, who were seeing things and terrified. And was there anyone to look after them? No, well, there were a couple of very good women from the local Uniting Church. That was it. They were dumped. And that was turning public housing into vertical psychiatric wards. You know, it's not even fair on the other tenants. Now, the flats at the bottom of my street are now quieter and calmer than they've ever been probably in their history. I mean, I've heard stories of people being shot at from up the high floors of the flats. You know, one of the girls at St Aloysius was shot in the shoulder by a bloke with a gun in one of the high-rise. What's happened there? But our flats are full of Africans, and they're Muslims, and they don't drink. So you've got no idea the difference it makes to the behaviour of the suburb, because they don't drink. They're families, and the rest are elderly people and people on invalid pensions. But what the housing department is left with is that it's got to build all this stuff, but where do they do it? And they can't buy new land, and we can't do more Craigie birds. So they've got to snatch up any available land that is in public ownership, whether it's owned by councils, But when they built the big housing estates in the 1960s and 70s, and remember suburbs like Reservoir were entirely built by the government. Huge amounts of Preston, Pascoe Vale, Broadmeadows, Glenroy, that's all built by the government. But the land was available then. It's no longer available. So what they are doing is moving back into those areas where quite small houses were put on enormous blocks of land. Now a lot of them turned into private dwellings. The people were given the chance under Kennett to buy them. That means they're lost from the public list of available housing. And I remember Richard Wynne talking about this, that many of them have got tenants in them, have been there all their married lives. They're now widows, they've raised their family, the family's moved on, and they've got 3 bedrooms. And 2 of those bedrooms are filled with junk. But at the same time, they can't take a gun to their head and force them to go and live in North Melbourne in the high-rise, because they've got no friends there. So what the Housing Commission has been doing for quite a long time is slowly rebuilding those estates with apartments and small villas, and what they're able to do now is do what they didn't have before, which is to give them proper insulation, central heating and air conditioning, and proper bathrooms and laundries. And they can put more people on the same envelope of land. But they do that slowly and stage by stage because they don't want to disrupt people. They've got to move them somewhere while they build and demolish, and then they can move back again. And they're always given the choice when they're asked to leave, and this will apply to people in the towers. You get a choice of 3 places. You get where you would like to go, and you have the absolute right to return when your part is rebuilt. So, but the point is that it's extraordinarily distressing to have to move like that, and that it doesn't help people to whip them up in a state of outrage at this happening when they actually need support with what is a major catastrophic life change. A major cause of depression is moving house, and particularly being forced to move house. So it's not trivial, it's big, and you don't do a good job by going and whipping up people's anger at something that does have to happen. Now, you talk about rights. Their rights are to being housed, not necessarily to stay in that particular place. But what they've done with the people, this has happened around Heidelberg West, they've moved people, they've stayed in the area, they've kept their friends and connections, and they've now in a place that they're absolutely thrilled with the change in their living conditions. The North Melbourne Abbotsford Street apartments were one of the first blocks ever built in an area that was known ironically as Happy Valley, because the people were so rough, and they had a footy team and no one would ever play with them. That's the territory of the shin boners, which is what North Melbourne footy team was known as, that the Happy Valley footy team was so terrifying that no one would play with them. Those apartment blocks were built on the site of the very worst slums in North Melbourne. One street, I think every man in the street was in jail at one stage. So they were built, and that was started in 1938, so it's one of the very first public housing ventures that they did. So then, but the point is that they were, like so many, blocks of 3 stories at all sorts of different angles, with big areas of vacant land, a few desultory play areas, no trees, external laundries on the ground or on the top floor. What was happening? Well, of course, there was a doctor nearby who was doing heroin, so they were walking into needles all the time. They were scary because there were distressed people there. But the other problem was that they had no lifts; they were all stairs. And then by the end of by 10 years ago, nearly all the tenants were disability tenants. or they're old. And they had such appalling insulation that I remember one man telling me he said, I couldn't turn the heating on, it was freezing, but the heating was so expensive I couldn't afford it on my pension. And in summer they're death traps. So against huge opposition led by the Greens, they have been pulled down. They are now going to have an increased number of social housing on that thing. Social housing means housing at the same rate of rent and security as public housing. The public housing is sort of a certain block kept for people with very high special needs, so that in our public housing group, within the social housing, the bottom of my street, the Hotham Estate, there is a unit for men and boys who've just come out of jail. They don't tell anyone where it is. So you have to have those sorts of provisions for people. But what's happened in Hardwick Street and that area in North Melbourne is they've built an extraordinary complex of new apartments for young people. They'll be affordable because on the land lease scheme, the developer doesn't have to pay for the land. So this building cost goes right down. This has also already been done in Kensington. So the flats are cheaper to buy. They've also, because there are a lot of social housing flats there, people might think, oh, it wouldn't be very nice living to those people. That keeps prices down, so that's good. But the major reason is that there's on this land lease which is there for 40 years, and then it all reverts back to the government. But what it means is they've taken out for people building housing, both for own and for affordable and for social renters, they've taken out the cost of the land element. And they've started to use the land more rationally. So a place that had about 800 units has now got something like 4,000. And in the same parcel of land, they have built a new primary school. And they were able to do that on free land. So that's just one development in North Melbourne. With the high-rise, the plans to demolish them will not be completed for another 30 years. It is a very slow business because you've got to move all those people into secure housing of their choice. And what's happened in the past is a lot of people from towers, as happened in Kensington, they had to pull down one of the towers there because it fell apart. They changed their technique of building. It was the only one that was really dodgy and it had major faults in it. That they moved people out, and about half the families that were moved out preferred to stay where they were moved to, because by then the kids had settled. They'd gone into a house usually from being in an apartment, because the Ministry of Housing's preference is to house people in houses. So, particularly families in houses, with children. So they'd been moved, so about half came back. So people therefore do have some choice, and they're coming back to a place that's got lifts, security, air conditioning, proper insulation and central heating, plus proper internet and all of those things, plus gardens. And the other important thing in the design of these new setups is that people can drive a car to the front door. On the old estates, if you wanted to unload something from a car, you had to haul it a long way across the pathways. So that affects, for instance, someone wants to get to the doctor and they're partly disabled, you've got to get them a long distance to a motor car to be able to get them away. So all of those sorts of annoying things, which were a really big issue for people in everyday life, will be fixed by this. But we don't underestimate the trauma of it all. But the government the only choice it's got is to use what land it has, and it has meant, of course, significant resistance from residents and councils when it's tried to use land which is, say, owned by the council. So as you know, this has happened in Yarra. Suddenly Yarra couldn't have more social housing. And what's happened in places like Darebin, particularly also, oh no, we don't like the design. The design's not right, so what a pity. But, there's been a very nasty middle class pushback against social housing. We believe in public housing, but not here. And that has applied to Brighton. It has happened right through the suburbs, but in fact a lot of the land around the place and the places that need to be redeveloped are all over the place. And those flat apartments and walk-ups that are made with precast concrete are all crumbling and falling apart. The towers are probably okay structurally, but they have a limited life. They will have to come down at some stage. And the amount of land available in the North Richmond estate is not as much as, say, is available in the Atherton Gardens estate, where there are very large areas of land around those towers, and which is problematic because it's pretty scary at night to walk from the street, from the tram stop to your tower. So that's some of the issues that if a government's going to do it, and the only instrument we've got to fix the housing crisis without a revolution from the rich and without causing, more seriously, very severe distress, particularly to older people who own property, is to be doing it collectively, to be committing to a shared concept of human rights, and to be a little bit more trusting of how governments are going about it, and not allow the media to scare us, because it makes a great story. One of the really big scandals which got me furious was a few years ago. There's a lot of angst going on about the redevelopment that happened at the Carlton estate, and where they had a mixed community. And so an academic produced a paper which claimed to show that if you mixed people socially, it was bad, and it was condescending. Now, you'll find in the global world literature a little bit of thing which says that caused problems, but overwhelmingly the literature is that if people who are in social housing are invisible and their children are invisible at school, that's really good for everyone. And it's not good locking people up into ghettos. And what the opposition to these developments, and it's been led by the Greens and now the Socialists, is they want ghettos. They want people stigmatised. They want people kept different instead of making them being able to be part of the community. Canberra has a huge amount of social housing. All of it is salt and pepper, spread throughout that you would never know, from street to street. That's how it should be. That's democratic. That's fair. And that's giving people the chances they need, the families who need a secure shelter. We've got to be able to do that. We've got this horrific problem of the price of land and the stakeholders in keeping the value of land high. We're not going to be able to have government action which will make it all magically get cheaper. So, and the only way it will magically get cheaper is we have a massive depression on the scale of the 1930s. Now, if you want that, you could.
Can I have an indication, please, of people who have either a comment or a question? Could you put up your hand?
Yeah. All right, I can stop.
So that's all right. So we'll keep it short, just in the time that we have remaining.
I just want to know, what's the concept of Crown land and how is it administered?
Right, well, in fact, King Charles III owns all of Australia. So the Crown owns everything, and then it gives titles to people to be able to own it privately. So when Australia was settled, the squatters squatted and paid tiny rents for land owned by the Crown. So when Doug put the Union Jack in the ground and claimed it for Great Britain, it was owned by the Crown. So if we became a republic, one of the things you could do in that transfer would be to transfer the notional ownership of the whole land to Indigenous Australians.
That's
Everybody panicking? But, I mean, they wouldn't mean... Now, the Crown therefore has certain land which it administers, national parks, government land, and land which hasn't been allocated.
Thank you. Over here.
May public-private partnerships
Yes.
to build things, and I have to say, I was disappointed by the Greens' attitude to what was going to happen down around Collingwood Town Hall.
Mm.
And my understanding was it was going to be public-private, and people just blew up at the idea. What's your view on
Well,
that?
modern economic thinking, and if you're interested in the person who says a lot about this, it's a woman called Mariana Mazzucato, who's one of the most powerful economic thinkers in Europe and North America. She lives in England, she's Italian but grew up in America, so she speaks like an American but she's very Italian. What she's saying is that the way we make the modern world work is a partnership between government and private money, and the private sector, and she uses the example of the space shot to go to the moon, where there was a huge collaboration between universities, government and private enterprise, which produced an extraordinary leap in innovation and technology. Now, what she's saying is that governments have to become a lot more interventionist, but on the other hand, they don't have that much money unless they print it, which they can do, but if they print too much, it'll all blow up. Who's got the money? The private sector. So therefore, you've got to incentivise the private sector to make a proper partner of it where it behaves itself. And this is what they did with the American moonshot, that they had very strict regulations about the way things were, a procurement, which stopped manipulation. Now you can look her up, Mazzucato, Mazzucato. And she's got lots of talks on YouTube, so you can watch that. So what it means is that you're harnessing private money into public service, and therefore what matters is the way that partnership is regulated and the way you manage procurement and oversight of the spending of that money, because if you're going to take government money, you have responsibilities. So if the thing is, we either struggle on with limited resources from taxation, which doesn't provide anywhere near enough, or else we harness our economy and our real wealth to servicing everyone.
Thank you. Over here.
I'm interested in your attitude to cars, because do you think we have the right to drive?
I suppose it's inevitable rather than the right, because we've built our cities around people being mobile with cars. So American and Australian cities are impossible to live in without a car. And if you live in Craigieburn, you need 3, and they can usually barely afford one. So cars are done a huge damage, but they've also been extraordinarily liberating for people. It's enabled us to live much further apart from the centre of a city. It's given people individual freedom. Don't forget how liberating a car has been. So how do we manage the balance between public transport, of which we need more, but someone like me doesn't manage very well on public transport. And I can't ride a bike anymore. I used to, but don't keep bullying me about riding a bike. I can't, I fall off. So it's a question of balance and ways in which we can reduce our dependence on cars. But with a suburban city, it's very hard not to have cars. I think that the inner city, that the suburban rail loop will be brilliant, because that's going to suddenly link, because one of the problems is not people getting to the CBD, it's getting across town to jobs and work. So that will be absolutely brilliant. So you might end up much more with the people who are on the road, who are people like tradesmen and business people who've got to take equipment and goods with them to places, but people who are travelling to work without those things could be much using other forms of transport.
Thank you. Question?
Well, it's really more a comment. I'd just like to say that we live in a society, and Australia thinks of themselves as being very sophisticated. But when you think how far away we've come from the Maslow hierarchy of needs, food, shelter and clothing, I would suggest we need to look how sophisticated perhaps we're not.
Yes, no, I think that's a very fair comment.
It really is a public, I don't mean anyone individual, a public shame that in a country as wealthy as this, we have insufficient housing for the populace.
But it's about distribution of wealth. You see, we can be wealthy, but it's a question of, that's the politics. And the fact is that those who have the wealth are too scared to share it. So don't blame politicians. Politicians have to do what they are allowed to do by the electorate.
Can I ask you, is it scared or should we call it greed?
Both, I think. But it's fear a lot. I know, in talking around town and people start thinking, you know, maybe people want my garden. I love my trees, said one lady in Tarak. And it's what they feel is their right to have that. And in a sense it is, because they've inherited it or they've got it from their husband, or, you know, but the thing is, we've got this big problem sitting like a big black oozing thing in the middle of our economy, which is soaking up, it's a black hole which is soaking up all this money, and the economy can't operate.
Thank you. Over there, yeah.
Do you think state governments have the skill and the ability to carry out and implement these really complex policies?
Yes, I think they have. I mean, I don't think one of the great achievements of the current state government has been the transition in energy policy. Lily D'Ambrosio, you have no idea, because they don't tell you and the police doesn't tell you, what an extraordinary transition we've made in Victoria to renewables. And that the Labor policy is that we transition to renewables in the context of the actual economic operations of our society and the people who need work. So a Labor government can't just say, oh, we'll close all the power stations. Oh, sorry everyone, I didn't realise that you needed a job. And or like Bob Brown would say about the forest, oh, well, they can all go and work in tourism. For God's sake, these people have been living in the forests since their convict ancestors. Half of them haven't got any teeth. That's the difference. What Jim Chalmers is trying to do, and I fear they're not going to get the chance to do it, is this sort of massive reconstruction of Australia. So in the Universities Accord that came out yesterday, part of it is talking about this sort of mission economy, where you're drawing in private business and universities and research and jobs everywhere into a big mission, and the mission would be dealing with climate change, and not just dealing with it in terms of electricity, but dealing with it in terms of how on earth are we going to feed ourselves if the Murray-Darling Basin becomes unlivable, which is what's predicted. We have a massive job to transfer the way we produce food into a safe, climatically safe thing. Now, these very big issues, I think, yes, we've got the capacity to do it, but we haven't got the political culture. We've got an extraordinarily useless and damaging opposition who will oppose everything. We've got people who are using every opportunity they can to wedge and create fear and anxiety and tension. And so there are too many people who get off on drama and protest instead of actual politics. It's all very well to complain and go on demonstrations. How about getting involved? How about joining a party? How about trying to make democracy work? And what they do is just leave it to a tiny handful of people who are funding from their own pockets everything in a Labor campaign, for instance, and then sit there and criticise. So, you you can't run democracy if no one participates.
Thank you. We've got 2 more questions. For
Yep.
those who miss out, I'll invite you to approach and after the session.
Excuse me, thank you.
That right?
Just a small question related to the public-private partnership, which I didn't fully understand your explanation. If the private sector is any being involved, and you were talking about the moonshot, if you invest in if private sector is investing, what's their payback? Is it access to land on the moon and the moon's mineral
No.
resources, or
Look, the iPhone came out of that.
it's access to knowledge.
Yeah, it's the knowledge which is the critical thing, and the point is that private industry draws on a huge amount of intellectual capital and research, say drugs for instance. All of that's done in universities. They don't pay for it. And this is one of the things that came out yesterday in the Accord. Private industry is not pulling its weight in all the intellectual capital and training and skill that universities provide. So the drug industry is one of the very biggest ones. Now, luckily in Australia we've got CSL. That has become a private company, and it was able to innovate in a way it couldn't when it was just purely government run, but it has retained its social licence, it's retained its commitment to the common good. So it's a way of doing business differently, and there are all sorts of different models for running capitalism. So, thinkers like Mariana Mazzucato or, a number of the other really innovative economists are now, there's lots of ways of doing capitalism.
Thank you. Last question.
Hi. You spoke about the government and the area, the land that they already own at the moment, and being able to utilise that in projects to build more housing. I'm wondering if, we're reaching crisis level, when does it sort of come up that what do we need, what do we want versus what do we need? So when do they start to sort of think outside the box? What are these big areas of land that we own that are, for example, public gardens and...
No, they wouldn't do that. And that's the Crown land.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, other things, that's just an example, but I'm sure there's lots of other examples that are similar, like chunks of land that are...
Yeah, well, I mean, when they built... yes, well, that's a very good example. Golf...
Sorry, the comment was such as golf courses.
Yeah. Now, I think that's a very good example. I mean, we could do with fewer, and a number have been developed. Box Hill was sold off. It's the ones all down in the Sandbelt which are an issue because they've got a surfeit of them. But when the Housing Commission did its very big build in the 1960s and 70s, the land they used was ex-race courses. So the massive development in Ascot Vale was the Ascot Vale racecourse. The John Wren Pony Racecourse in Richmond was the one that's quite small. And Caulfield Racecourse could be one. I don't think that's really a go. Moonee Valley is on the cards. That's another one.
Is that like Crown land?
No, that's
who owns that?
I don't know. They probably rent it from the government. So Moonee Valley, but when they built the Flemington estate, that was built on the Debney works. There was a big factory there that went out of business. And on South North Melbourne, that was built on land that flooded and was a marsh, and it had housing, but there was extremely bad conditions. So a lot of Richmond was also built on the particularly bad housing, but they also pulled down houses that would be okay now. What the big plan was to cover the whole of Carlton, from the edge of the city to North Carlton in high-rise apartments.
Let's stop there. That was like an engaging presentation. I'm sure you'll all agree. I'll pass the floor on to Gershon.
I was going to make my contribution with single-site covenants that never ever get mentioned, but a legacy of the 40s and 50s that are well and truly past their use-by date.
Yeah.
What is that?
Well, there's some properties, especially around the sort of middle suburbs, where there's a sort of planning control in the 40s. They put a covenant on the land as a single, you can only build one house on the land. And so there's heaps of these properties around Caulfield and wherever else.
Canmore would be one, I think.
Yeah.
And
they're very restrictive.
yeah.
It can be removed now, though.
Didn't
Do the
say
planning scheme.
As far as I know, I haven't seen one example where they
It
have
does have it quite a bit.
well, anyway.
So
That was,
Russell's done a big reform on these single site covenants.
yes, I think it should,
Victoria has to-
just ripped away. But Janet, I can't tell you, it's just amazing. I will want to say one thing, that I go into the Avenue bookshop a fair bit, and I do notice on the front table, there's always a big stack of Struggletown.
No.
I go in there 3 weeks later, and they're down to one.
Oh, that's
So-
good to hear.
So,
I need the royalties.
you've got a popular following in Richmond.
Yeah.
Thank you again for explaining the complexities of our city, land ownership, the distribution of wealth, and the housing as a collective interest, but also a collective responsibility. And thank you for sharing your
Thank you.
thoughts with us today. And a round of applause. I'd also like to give a round of applause to Penelope. The question around housing and how we tackle housing, the government's introduced planning reforms, an attempt to try and motivate further housing supply. We've got Michelle Quigley, who was Justice Michelle Quigley, former head of VCAT. She's going to come and talk to us for our next coffee catch-up. She's going to explain perhaps some of the intricacies of those planning reforms, but also whether or not the changes or planning changes will actually deliver the sort of outcomes that the government's hoping to achieve, or whether it's actually going to lead to another forum of confrontation, and that's through the court system. So I'll be very fascinated to hear her opinions and her thoughts. So that's our next coffee catch-up, which is the last Monday of March. And we're working on our guest speaker for the April coffee catch-up. But Janet, thank you. Back to you. Thank you very much again. On behalf of all of us, please accept that.
Thank you very much.
Just to acknowledge the relief that this calibre of forum gives to us all. Herschel, once again, thank you.
Can I thank you all for being a very tolerant audience? I gave you a pretty politically biased blast, but at the moment it is all politics. And you may not like Mr Albanese, you may not like Labor, but honestly, if they lose government, we're in deep trouble. Because I think they're the only group who've got the will and the skill. They've got a very skillful cabinet to be able to do what has to be done. And they're not going to get everything right, and they're going to make mistakes, and they're going to get a lot of stick, but none of the others can do that. So I'm unashamedly biased.